Dr. Elaine Howard Ecklund. She holds 3 positions at Rice University. She is the Herbert S. Autry Chair in Social Sciences. She is the Professor of Sociology, and she is Director of the Baniuk Institute for Religious Tolerance. But what does she do with her time? Just ending this last academic year, she was for 12 years the founding director of the Religion and Public Life program at Rice University. She focuses on religion, immigration, and science. Her degrees are all from Cornell, but God can still work with that, you know. She holds a Bachelor of Science in Human Development and the MA and PhD in Sociology. That's wonderful. And she's published numerous books and articles. 5 of her books are published by Oxford University Press, which is just about a mile from here as the crow flies. It is the largest and second most ancient publishing establishment in the world, and to have 5 books published by OUP is incredible. In 2017, I think, is that 2021, she published the book, Varieties of Atheism in Science. I need to get that book. And in 2020, she published Why Science and Faith Need Each Other. So I think we need to hear from her. So without further ado, will you join me in welcoming Dr. Elaine Howard Ecklund.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction. Boy, the speakers and the music give new meaning to tough act to follow. Whoa, okay. So, as a sociologist, for about the past 15 years, I have been studying what scientists think about religion and what religious people think about science. And as part of that work, my team and I at Rice University have surveyed about 40,000 scientists and completed over 1,000 in-depth interviews with them. So I know a lot about what scientists think about a lot of things, but perhaps my greatest claim to fame is that I actually married a scientist who is here with me today, my husband Carl, who's a particle physicist, and our daughter is also here with us attending the conference. We have also surveyed more than 30,000 members of the American public, including Christians, Muslims, people who are Jewish, and those from many other traditions, all about the topic of what they think about science and its place in the world and its connection to their faith. So that's all of my scholarly work. But for the past few years, I have been thinking a lot about what my role as a Christian is in this whole science and faith discussion. And to that end, I took something of what was a leap of faith for me and wrote a book specifically for the Christian church called Why Science and Faith Need Each Other, 8 Shared Values That Move Us Beyond Fear. And I want to talk today a little bit about 3 key insights and 4 shared values that science and faith have with one another. And in particular, that the scientific community and the faith community, and of course there are those who very much inhabit both worlds, the kinds of shared values and concerns that might help those communities really collaborate better with one another. And I'll try to keep my insights brief. I know also that I'm between you and lunch. I shouldn't have said that out loud. I'm actually, I'm a storyteller, and right now what's coming to mind when I just said I'm going to keep my insights brief is I was on this panel once for a scientific association, and I was, this sounds like a man walks into a bar or a pub here joke, but I was on a panel with an imam, a pastor, and a rabbi, and like me, and I was the scholar, and these men of faith went first, and so they, the pastor, of course, said, I have 3 main points, very Trinitarian, and then the imam, I was like, also says I have 3 main points. And I was like, surely the rabbi will have more points than 3. And he too says I have 3 main points. And here I am, I'm a scholar, right? So we never have 3 main points, right? So I had literally like pages of notes, and I was like rifling through them and so I just said what I thought I had to say in the moment. I'm like, I have 3 main points too, but I have 37 subpoints. So I actually only have 7 points right now. So 3 insights from my work that I think are useful to us as Christians. The first key insight is this: when it comes to science and faith, there is a fine line between fear and anger. This is a story about my daughter, so I'm going to have to pay her off after. Here is the time when I remember being most afraid in my life. And like many of you, there have been many times when I've been afraid. I've had major surgeries. I had a near-death experience once. I've had hard things happen in my life, and I know many of you have too. But I can tell you, if you ask me when the one time was when I was most afraid, I can tell you right when it was. My daughter was about 3 years old, and I was picking her up from daycare. And that day I was tired. I was parenting alone. She begged to stay a few more minutes to play with her friends, and I acquiesced. They started a game of hide and seek, and I turned away like we often do to talk to other parents. And daylight was starting to fade away, and I expected any moment that she would sidle up to me and wrap her arms around my leg. After a few minutes, when they didn't happen, I started to look around and I said, "It's time to go." I called out, and no response. One by one, the other kids got in the car with their parents and drove away. I called out again and picked up my bag to where I thought she'd been playing, and I didn't see her. Then I called again. "Where are you?" My heart's starting to race a bit then, the kind of physical manifestation of panic. I checked up and down the street. I called out several more times. I actually got other parents involved at that point in looking. I lost all social decorum. I actually started opening car doors along the street because I thought, given her age, that she might have crawled into one of the cars. A man comes up to me and says, "Ma'am, are you trying to break into my car?" With tears rolling down my face, I just enlisted him in the search, gave him a description, and sent him off to search as well. After about 10 minutes, the director of the daycare center pulled me aside and said she'd activated the safety protocol for a missing child, and she'd be calling the police in about 5 minutes. In that moment, I believed fully that I might not find my daughter, and I felt fear like I have never felt since. Then I noticed a little boy standing right beside me, and he says, "She's over there." He told us he'd heard her breathing and her giggle as he came near. The bottom line is this: the entire time I was searching, she had been hiding about 10 feet away from me. She'd heard me, she'd heard the associate director, she'd heard my friend, and the others helping in the search, and all of us calling to her, and yet she'd chosen not to answer. She comes up to me. I hugged her so tight, she asked me to loosen my grip. I was so incredibly, incredibly grateful. And then, I let her down softly on the ground, then I picked her up. I look at her little face and I yelled, "I'm so angry, I want to give you such a spanking." I didn't actually spank her. The director of the daycare, the one who called the safety protocol then, wiser than I was in that moment, touched my arm gently, and she said words that have stuck with me. She said, "Let's take a step back. There is a fine line between fear and anger." I bring this lesson to my academic work on how people of faith view science and scientists, and how scientists view faith and people of faith. Fear can often masquerade as anger. When we see conflict between religious communities and scientific communities, we should take a step back, and we should examine, might there be underlying fear, and really try to understand what those fears are. My second key insight is this: that social sciences and sociologists in particular, I think if used rightly, bring something special to understand the intersection between faith and science. I'm interested in group behaviors, the soci, and I'm interested in particular how groups have an impact on one another and can bring changes to society. And one way we study this as social scientists and as sociologists in particular is by listening to people's life stories and analyzing to what extent these stories represent the groups individuals are part of. Sociological data also allows us to get past, I think, these loud, combative voices that say represent whole groups of people to ask, do these voices really represent whole groups of people? Sociology doesn't have the same tools as philosophy or theology. It can't really tell us the right way to live. But if we know how we want, for example, our churches, our communities, our laboratories to be different, then sociology, I think, can help us understand the real group dynamics that are at bay and help us understand how we can engage in practices and even in our language of spiritual disciplines that might help us effect change to groups and group dynamics. When it comes to examining science and religion, then, there's a key insight. Science and religion are not just sets of ideas or thought systems, although they are those things. They're not just beliefs, although they are those things. They are also, science and faith, are communities of people. Communities like laboratories and churches and universities and denominations, and some people are part of both communities. I think I got like 6 points in there. That was actually only point 2. So here's another insight, a third. Remember, there's 3 insights and then 4 shared values. Science and faith share core values, I want to argue, that if used well could bring these communities together to work for the common good. And the global push during these past 2 years, both to address the pandemic medically and scientifically, and now and in the future to heal its incredible collateral damage, which we've heard some about already. Damage that is having an inequitable impact on particular groups and communities, I would argue requires both our best thinking and our best understanding and our best cooperation as religious and scientific communities working together at top capacity. I want to turn now to discussing 4 of the 8 values from my book, Why Science and Faith Need Each Other. Values that I think can lead us to some extent beyond fear towards that sense of collaboration. The first value is curiosity. The first value is curiosity. You remember some conversations for the rest of your life. I interviewed Jill for my first study of how scientists view religion. Over 15 years ago. She was already at the top of her field, a biologist leading a successful laboratory at an elite research university that shall remain nameless, one of the only women in her institution at her level, and one of the less than 10% of women in her field of science at her level. As I walked toward her office, I noticed her door had a sign of the Darwin fish eating the Christian fish, the ichthus symbol. I'm sure some of you have seen it. I was conducting my first study ever on scientists' attitudes towards faith, and the sign, frankly, made me a little nervous. As I knocked tentatively, I started to think it would be totally okay with me, maybe not for the research study, but for me personally, if Jill had forgotten our appointment. But she came to the door right away. She did nothing to put me at ease. She didn't greet me with a handshake or a smile. Instead, she curtly asked me to come in and directed me to sit on a metal chair across the desk from her. She told me she had nothing to say about science and faith. I can't remember now if the air conditioning in her office was kind of chilly or if maybe I just felt kind of cold. My first question to Jill was a simple one that could have been answered yes or no. I just asked if she considered herself a person of faith, and if so, what that might mean to her. No, she says, I'm simply an atheist. I then asked her whether she had always been an atheist. I asked if she'd been raised in a faith tradition. It was also the type of question that could have been answered yes or no. I was taken aback when Jill looked away from me and her eyes began to fill with tears. In the years since then, I have personally interviewed nearly 1,000 scientists about their views on faith. Jill is one of the only ones who cried. As her tears welled up, my own feelings turned from fear and apprehension actually to curiosity. I was curious about why the question about her faith elicited such an emotional response. Jill told me she'd come from a Christian family, an evangelical Christian family, and as a child had spent a lot of time at church. She was also raised in a rural community, and she developed a real love of the outdoors. She talked about the big sky. She began to see the beauty in nature, and she spent a lot of time doing her schoolwork too. She said she loved her biology and her chemistry and her physics classes. She says, in her words, I was a total geek and I got fantabulous grades. But as she became more curious about the natural world, Jill also became concerned about aspects of her faith. She brought questions about the origin and the development of life on earth and the role of God in creation to her parents and her youth pastor. At that point, Jill did not know she would go into science. She was simply an inquisitive kid, following and feeding her natural curiosity. She told me when I asked hard questions, though, about the faith, I was told by my pastor just to make a decision to believe, to forget about science. It was an answer that didn't satisfy her. She tried several times to talk with her youth group leaders about questions science brought to her mind, but her experience with them was similar. She was consistently told not to explore so much. I feel like religion was a mechanism by which judgment was passed on people who were different, she recounted. And me, in my personal history, I felt different because I was so inquisitive and it didn't work out well for me. By the time she was in her teens, she'd left her church. How do we nurture curiosity in our faith communities and in scientific communities as an antidote to fear? This, to me, as I reflect on the writings of C.S. Lewis, has such resonance, such incredible curiosity in his fiction and in his nonfiction, just such an incredible, authentic, and I would say spiritual curiosity. As a character trait, the philosopher Elias Baumgarten writes, curiosity is the disposition to want to know more or learn more about a wide variety of things. The more one has this character trait, the more often or the more intensely one will on particular occasions experience a desire or an urge to investigate, to want to learn, to want to know more. In our current culture, the word curious seems small and even weak. It brings to mind a child wondering what is around the corner before she takes a look. Our culture prefers, especially now in these times, seemingly stronger words like expert, leader, and winner. But we need to value, I would argue, more highly in our societies the ability to ask questions that help us understand, and I think this has resonance with what we heard earlier today, to help us understand others and ourselves, questions that help us lead better and more authentic lives. Let's ask different questions when we feel afraid, when we disagree with someone. When you happen upon someone you disagree with, let curiosity replace fear and anger. Ask why. Curiosity is a show of strength, a yearning to push the boundaries of knowledge because we're not afraid to do so. Scientists like Jill are known for their curiosity, and I would argue Christians ought to be known for our curiosity as well. For example, the string theorist Sylvester James Gates Jr., my second favorite physicist in the world, the first, of course, being my husband, the first Black American to have an endowed chair in physics at a major research university and current president of the American Physical Society, says he got used to being curious in his family. He asked hard questions of faith and of science at an early age. He says, I remember once asking my dad, Dad, do you remember me as a kid asking all kinds of questions? You always seem to have an answer for everything. How did you do that? And his dad said, you're misremembering. What you don't remember is that I actually didn't have an answer for very much. What I wanted you to do was just ask the questions. If I didn't have an answer, I told you to hold off. I'd go find a book or someone else or some other resource and get back to you in the next day or two to help you think through your questions even further. No one in Gates's family was a scientist. but they created an environment that nurtured curiosity in him, and I think the world is the better for it. My research shows that many Christians are curious about the relationship between science and faith and how they integrate science and faith. This kind of tension for some can be incredibly painful and stressful, and I think we need to acknowledge that. I want to see Christian communities become safe places for the curious, especially those who are curious about the intersections between science and faith. The most valuable resource in our Christian communities is often those who have personal experience and accomplishment, fellow Christians who are scientists or who have successfully integrated these things. From these Christians, I think we can learn new ways of looking at the world, of fostering and supporting this kind of intersection between science and faith. Churches need to become a place and places that are really known for offering the reward of nurturing and satisfying curiosity about science. The second shared value I want to talk about today is humility, and particularly intellectual humility, so deeply related to Lewis's writings, as others have said today. I have been humbled many a time. If you had asked me when I first started my research 15 years ago on what scientists think about religion, I would have told you, as a good sociologist of religion, which I think I am, that there are many ways of being a religious person and probably many ways of being a religious scientist. If you had asked me whether there were many ways of being an atheist scientist, I would have said, no, probably not. There's probably just one. You, by definition, don't believe in God. That's what an atheist means. I was so sure I was right. But over the years, especially given the amount that I've taught and the kinds of questions that I've had from my students, I've learned not to trust my initial judgments sometimes. I've learned to doubt some of my initial assumptions, especially the assumptions I have about characteristics of groups. My studies of scientists over the past 15 years have shown me that indeed there are varieties of atheism among scientists, and with David Johnson, I have written a book about that topic, Varieties of Atheism Among Scientists. Of course I would, I'm an academic, right? That's my calling card of making of books there is no end. This is just one of the ways that my research, though I think more importantly than the book we wrote, has really changed me as a person. It has really humbled me. Humility is recognizing the limitations of our own understandings and abilities and perspectives. From a Christian standpoint, humility is being deeply aware that we are not God. Humility, especially intellectual humility, is also a key scientific virtue. In the study of scientific virtues conducted by the philosopher Robert Pennock, he found that humility to evidence, defined as the willingness to abandon a preferred hypothesis when faced with conflicting results, was one of the 10 most widely held values of science, as named by elite scientists. The third shared value that I want to share with you is the value of shalom. Shalom is the Hebrew word that comes from a root that means completeness and perfection. It is to seek the peace, the harmony, the well-being and prosperity that comes from the flourishing of all creation. In my interviews with Christians who are scientists and scientists who are Christians and those from other faith traditions, I have found that many of them draw on the concept of shalom and really its shared concept of stewardship, to understand their work and the world and what they're doing as scientists. I want to say this: shalom cannot be pretended. We can't pretend that there's peace there when there isn't. That's not what it means to honor this spiritual virtue. In its best sense, I think, in our current world, shalom and pursuing shalom when it comes to integrating science and faith means to get involved with the messiness of the world, to try to mix it up with structures that are not just, to make them more so. I love what was said about politics. We very much see that kind of impulse among some Christians to try to really mix it up in a really positive way to make structures just that are not so. The theologian Walter Brueggemann writes in The Prophetic Imagination, Jesus, in his solidarity with the marginal ones, is moved to compassion. Compassion constitutes a radical form of criticism, for it announces that the hurt is to be taken seriously, that the hurt is not to be accepted as normal and natural, but as abnormal and unacceptable condition for humanness. Thus, the compassion of Jesus is not to be understood as a personal emotional reaction only, but as a kind of public criticism in which he dares to act upon his concern against the context of the entire numbness of the society. And from C.S. Lewis's The Problem of Pain, pain insists upon being attended to. God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our consciences, but shouts in our pain. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. Many of the scientists who are Christians that I have spoken with through my studies talk a lot about using their scientific work to bring justice in the world, and in particular to think about equity within the scientific community itself, especially increasing gender and race representation in science as one of their goals. Some of these scientists specifically connect their faith as Christians to these efforts, especially to increase educational opportunities for those who don't have access to good science education in the beginning part of their educational trajectories. When we look at the U.S. scientific community, we see that non-white people, but especially Black and Hispanic Americans in the U.S. and U.S.-born Asian Americans as well, are actually vastly underrepresented in science. For example, Black Americans, who comprise about 13% of the U.S. population, make up less than 1% of all those who have careers in science, medicine, and related technology fields. And yet, Black Americans and women are all overrepresented in churches and in the Christian community. A related problem is that Christians from underrepresented minority groups often don't hear about scientists who believe like them or see scientists who look like them. And so they face what I have called in my work a sort of double or triple marginalization as an underrepresented racial group, a gender group, and a faith group in the sciences, not something we talk about very much. One Christian geneticist I interviewed, who's one of the few Black women in her field at a major university, she said during the 5 years she spent as a student at an elite institution, there was only one Black speaker among her department's dozens of speakers that were brought into their weekly science seminar. For a lot of African Americans in particular, science is a no trespassing zone, one Black pastor said. He said, I think it would be incredibly helpful to have someone of my own color in science and my own faith as a Christian in science. To see one of your own would give such an inspiration. Those who have been in our most marginalized in our societies are often deeply compelled to fight for justice and engage in efforts that demarginalize others. The science career can be used to care for people in the interest of justice, equity, and human flourishing. And I think we've seen many positive examples of that during these pandemic times. It can be used to seek shalom for the world and the people in it. I want to end by briefly touching on gratitude, another important value for these times, and I think a way of addressing the fears that people have of each other right now. It's hard to be angry with someone or afraid of someone that you're grateful for. Through my studies and my personal experiences, I have found that there is a sense where those who are most deeply involved in the science and faith work and the integration of science and faith are also those who come to a deep sense of gratitude for the other, who really hold their own views loosely and have a sense that they can really learn from the other, that everyone is made in the image of God and that there's something to be grateful for in each individual person. A pastor I interviewed about the science and faith interface said this to me. He said, what's so unique in my own African American church is that my church and the African American Christian tradition is rooted in the midst of incredible pain and injustices in its history. It's still rooted in a theology of gratitude, which is a very different posture for addressing whatever life issues come your way. And that could separate how you would approach science or a scientist, or how you would approach theological questions when you start with the refrain, God is good. And which many who are part of this tradition then say all the time. According to the writer Diana Butler Bass, who wrote in her book on gratitude, gratitude is not about stuff. Gratitude is the response to the surprise of our very existence, to sensing that inner light and realizing the astonishment that we are even here, the sacred, social, and scientific events that brought each of us into being, that allows us to value every single person, whether or not we agree with them, whether or not we are part of their group, to value every single person, that allows us, because we know who we are, that allows us to cry out like the poets from the Christian tradition, I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Thank you.